When I opened that rusty metal box my grandmother kept under her hospital bed, my hands started to shake. Inside, there was something I should never have seen, something that would forever change the way I remembered the woman who raised me. My grandmother Martha had advanced Alzheimer's, and the doctor said she only had a few weeks left to live. But in her last moments of lucidity, she grabbed my arm with a strength I didn't think she still had, looked straight into my eyes, and said, "Under the bed, Elena. Under the bed is the truth." I thought it was just the disease, meaningless words from a mind slowly shutting down. However, that same night, when the nurses left the room, I knelt beside her bed and slid my hand under the mattress. My fingers touched something cold, metallic, heavy. I pulled it out carefully, wiping away the built-up dust, and saw an old box with a small padlock hanging open, as if someone had wanted me to find it. When I opened it, the air left my lungs. Inside, there were no jewels, no sweet family keepsakes. There were black and white photographs, clippings from old newspapers, a bundle of bills tied with a red ribbon, and a small notebook with names written by hand, some of them crossed out in black ink. And at the very bottom, wrapped in an embroidered handkerchief, there was a .38 caliber revolver. In that moment, I understood that the woman I knew as my sweet grandmother Martha, the one who baked cinnamon cookies every Sunday and told me bedtime stories, had lived a completely different life before she became my grandmother. A dark, dangerous life, full of secrets she never wanted to share. And now, with Alzheimer's stealing her last fragments of memory, that truth had come to light in the most unexpected way. If this story is pulling you in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this video with someone who loves real stories that give you goosebumps. And tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered something about your family that changed everything you thought you knew? Now then, let's continue with this story that still keeps me awake at night. The phone rang at 3 in the morning, the kind of call that always brings bad news. It was the General Hospital of San Luis, and the nurse's voice sounded tired but urgent. "Miss Elena Vargas, your grandmother Martha has had a crisis. You need to come immediately." I got dressed in 5 minutes without even combing my hair, and drove through the empty city streets with my heart pounding in my throat. My grandmother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's 3 years earlier, and every month that passed was like watching pieces of her being erased. The doctors had warned me the day would come when she wouldn't recognize me, but I was never prepared for that. When I walked into her room in the palliative care wing, I found her sitting on the bed, eyes wide open but lost, staring out the window as if she were seeing something I couldn't see. "Grandma, it's me, Elena," I said softly, taking her wrinkled hand in mine. She turned her head slowly toward me, and for a second it seemed like she didn't know me at all. But then her lips moved, forming barely audible words. "Elena, my girl, you have to know." She broke, and a tear rolled down her cheek. I moved closer, squeezing her hand, trying to comfort her without knowing what was tormenting her so much in that moment. "Under the bed," my grandmother whispered with a kind of intensity that scared me. "Under the bed is everything I never told you, everything I never should have done." I looked at her, confused, thinking it was another one of those episodes where the disease made her talk nonsense, mixing past and present in strange ways. But there was something different in her eyes this time, a moment of clarity that cut through the fog of Alzheimer's like a beam of light. "What's under the bed, Grandma?" I asked gently, without letting go of her hand. She squeezed her eyes shut as if gathering all her strength to form the next words. "The truth, Elena. The truth about who I really am. I'm not the woman you think." My heart skipped a beat. My grandmother Martha had been my anchor my whole life, the only constant after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. She raised me, gave me a home, taught me everything she knew about love, cooking, and how to survive in this hard world. The idea that there was something dark in her past, something she considered so terrible that she never told me, filled me with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Don't worry, Grandma. Everything's okay," I told her, even though inside I felt that nothing would ever be okay again after that night. My grandmother fell asleep soon after, exhausted by the effort of trying to communicate with me. I stayed in the plastic chair by her bed, watching her breathe slowly while the heart monitor marked a steady but weak rhythm. The room smelled of disinfectant and that indefinable hospital smell that always made me nervous. Outside the window, I could see the city lights flickering in the distance, San Luis Potosí, asleep under a starless sky. I looked down at the floor, at the dark space under the hospital bed, and a shiver ran down my spine. What could be there? Why had my grandmother, in what could be her last lucid hours, used her strength to tell me about that? I got up slowly, careful not to make noise, and knelt beside her bed. The floor was cold against my knees. I slid my hand under the mattress, feeling around in the darkness, and my fingers touched something cold, metallic, heavy. I pulled it out carefully, wiping away the built-up dust, and saw an old box with a small padlock hanging open, as if someone had wanted me to find it. When I opened it, the air left my lungs. Inside, there were no jewels, no sweet family keepsakes. There were black and white photographs, clippings from old newspapers, a bundle of bills tied with a red ribbon, and a small notebook with names written by hand, some of them crossed out in black ink. And at the very bottom, wrapped in an embroidered handkerchief, there was a .38 caliber revolver. In that moment, I understood that the woman I knew as my sweet grandmother Martha, the one who baked cinnamon cookies every Sunday and told me bedtime stories, had lived a completely different life before she became my grandmother. A dark, dangerous life, full of secrets she never wanted to share. And now, with Alzheimer stealing her last fragments of memory, that truth had come to light in the most unexpected way. My grandmother opened her eyes as the sun began to shine through the hospital window, tinting the white walls a pale orange. She looked straight at me, and this time there was recognition in her eyes, a clarity I hadn't seen in months. "You found it," she said, not as a question but as a statement. I nodded, speechless, feeling like a little girl again waiting for an explanation. "Sit down, Elena. I'm going to tell you something you were never supposed to know, but the Alzheimer's is stealing my time and I can't leave this world without you understanding where you come from." Her voice was firm now, stronger than it had been in months. She told me that when she was young, in the 1960s, she had worked in a nightclub on the border between Mexico and the United States, a place called El Pavo Real that was famous for its shows, its music, and for being a meeting point for people in certain kinds of business. "It wasn't just a club, Elena," she said, looking at me intently. "It was a place where money moved, where deals were made, where people who couldn't meet anywhere else came to negotiate. She wasn't just a waitress or a dancer, as I had assumed when I saw the pictures. She was the bookkeeper, the one who kept the accounts, who knew exactly how much money came in and went out, who owed what to whom, and when it was time to collect debts. I had power, Elena, more than a woman was supposed to have in that era. And with that power came enemies, dangers, decisions I had to make to survive." My grandmother closed her eyes as if she were watching the scene again in her mind. El Pavo Real was another world, full of luxury and violence mixed in ways you can't imagine. There were nights when French champagne flowed like water, when millionaires and criminals sat at the same table, when bets at the poker tables reached $50,000 in a single hand. She told me that the owner of the club, a man named Roberto Salazar, had been her mentor, and for a time, something more than that. He was a complicated man, Elena. He could be generous and brutal on the same night. He taught me how to keep books, how to read people, how to know when someone was lying just by looking into their eyes. But he also taught me that in that world, loyalty was more valuable than money, and betrayal was always paid with blood. She had seen terrible things in that club, fights that ended in death, deals gone wrong, people who walked in through the front door and left in bags through the back. I kept record of everything, Elena. I knew who owed money, who had betrayed whom, who was marked to die. And that notebook you found was my life insurance, because as long as I had that information, no one dared touch me. She explained that the names crossed out in black belonged to people who were no longer alive, people who had been eliminated for different reasons, unpaid debts, betrayals, or simply for knowing too much. And although she hadn't killed anyone directly, her information had sealed more than one person's fate. "That revolver you found," my grandmother said in a softer voice, "Roberto gave it to me when things started to get dangerous. He told me, 'Martha, in this business, the only person you can completely trust is yourself. If the moment comes, don't hesitate to use it.' She had carried it for years, hidden in her purse, under the bar counter, even under her pillow when she slept in the small apartment she had above the club. I never used it against anyone, you have to believe me. But there were nights when I had it in my hand, pointed at the door, waiting for someone to come settle scores with me." She told me about one particular night in 1967 when a group of men from a rival cartel came to the club looking for Roberto. I was alone in the office counting the money from the night. I heard the shots downstairs, the screams, the sound of tables breaking. I took out the revolver and turned off the lights, waiting in the dark. The men came upstairs looking for the accounting books, looking for evidence they could use against Roberto. One of them opened the door to my office. I was behind the desk with the revolver aimed straight at his head. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. I had my finger on the trigger, ready to shoot if he took one more step. But the man stepped back, said something to his companions, and they left without touching her. Later, I found out that man was the brother of someone I had helped years earlier, and he recognized me. That night, I understood that every action has consequences, that every favor repaid or forgiveness granted can save your life years later. Everything collapsed in 1971. There was a massive raid, coordinated between Mexican and U.S. authorities. They shut down El Popo Real and arrested almost everyone involved. Roberto Salazar was killed 2 weeks before the raid, executed in his own home for reasons that were never entirely clear. Some said he was betrayed by his partner, others that it was revenge from a father whose daughter had been mistreated at the club. I never knew the full truth, but with Roberto dead, I knew my time in that world was over. She managed to escape before the raid, warned by a contact in the police who owed her a favor. She took the money I had saved, about $30,000 in cash that I had been setting aside over the years, and I disappeared. I changed my name for a while, moved to San Luis Potosi, and started a completely new life as a seamstress. For years, she lived in fear, waiting for someone from the past to find her, for someone to come collect revenge or recover information. But time passed, people forgot, and I just became another working woman with a sewing machine and a past no one knew. When she met my grandfather, a good, simple man who worked in a factory, she decided she would never tell him the truth. He fell in love with the Martha I invented, not the Martha that I had been. And when he died, when you came into my life after your parents' tragedy, I swore you would never carry the weight of what I'd done. "Then why did you keep the box?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My grandmother let out a deep sigh. "Because a part of me could never forget who I had been, Elena. That box was a reminder that I had survived a world that devoured most of the people who entered it. It was a proof that I had been someone, not just the sweet grandmother who baked cookies." She explained that it was also a kind of insurance, although over the years that insurance lost its value. If someone from the past found me, I had evidence, names, dates, enough information to negotiate my life if necessary. But as the decades went by, as the people from that era died or disappeared, the box became more of a personal memorial than a survival tool. And when I started forgetting things because of the Alzheimer's, when I felt my mind betraying me, I knew I had to leave you something, some way for you to understand that people are not just what they seem on the surface, that we all have layers, secrets, versions of ourselves we hide from the world. The money she had saved, those $20,000, were for me. It's clean money, Elena. I earned it with my work, even if that work wasn't exactly legal. I want you to use it for something good, for your education, for your future, to build something I never could because I was always running. I sat in silence, processing everything I had just heard. My grandmother, the woman who taught me to knit, who comforted me when I had nightmares, who took me to church every Sunday, had been part of a criminal world I only knew from movies and books. "Do you regret what you did?" I asked her, needing to know if there was remorse in her heart. She thought for a long moment before answering. "I regret some things, Alina. I regret the people who suffered because of information I provided. I regret not having had the courage to get out of that world earlier. But I don't regret surviving. I don't regret being strong when women of my time were expected to be weak. I did what I had to do to live, and those decisions, even though they were dark, eventually led me to you." Her words broke my heart in a strange way, because I understood I was facing the true complexity of a human being. She wasn't completely good nor completely evil, but someone who had sailed through murky waters doing the best she could. "What do I do now with this information, Grandma? What am I supposed to do with all this?" I asked, feeling the weight of that knowledge crushing my chest. "You decide what to do with it, my girl. You can destroy everything, burn the notebook, throw the revolver into the river, spend the money and forget it ever existed. Or you can keep it. Remember, your grandmother was more complex than you thought, and understand that life isn't black and white." I spent the following days in a haze of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I loved my grandmother more than anyone in the world, and nothing she had done could change the 20 years of love and care she'd given me. On the other hand, I couldn't just ignore what I had discovered, pretend I didn't know she'd been part of a world where human life had a negotiable price. I did my own research, looking for information about El Pavo Real in old newspaper archives at the municipal library. I found several articles that confirmed my grandmother's story. The club had existed, it had been shut down in a raid in 1971, and Roberto Salazar had been killed weeks earlier. I also found a blurry photograph of a group of people being arrested outside the club, and although the image was unclear, I thought I recognized my grandmother among the crowd, younger, with dark hair and a defiant look. I spoke to a trusted lawyer without giving him specific details, asking about the statute of limitations on crimes and legal responsibility for events that happened more than 50 years ago. He assured me that anything that had occurred in the 1960s was already prescribed, that my grandmother would not face charges even if the information became public. That calmed me a bit, but it didn't solve my moral dilemma. Did I have the right to tell my grandmother's story? Or should I take her secrets to the grave, as she had planned to do? I decided I wouldn't tell anyone, at least not while she was alive. My grandmother's condition deteriorated quickly after that conversation. It was as if, after sharing her secret, her body finally allowed itself to let go. She went from having occasional lucid moments to being almost completely disconnected from reality. Some days she recognized me and called me by name. Other days she thought I was her younger sister, or her mother, or a complete stranger. I spent every afternoon at the hospital, sitting by her bed, sometimes reading to her, sometimes just holding her hand in silence. I took the box home and hid it in my closet, unable to decide what to do with it, but also unable to get rid of its contents. One night, while going through the notebook again, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the last page, hidden among the lines of names and numbers, there was an address in Monterey and a note that read, "Sister, Rosa Vargas, knows nothing." I froze. My grandmother had never talked to me about siblings. I had grown up believing she was an only child, that her whole family had died before I was born. But here it was, proof that she had a sister, my great-aunt, living in Monterey, presumably knowing nothing about Martha's criminal past. I decided that after the funeral, if that day ever came, I would look for this Rosa Vargas and try to learn more about the family I never knew I had. My grandmother Martha died on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after she revealed her secret to me. I was by her side, holding her hand, when her breathing became shallower and shallower until it finally stopped. The heart monitor emitted that long, continuous sound you always hear in movies, but in real life is 1,000 times more devastating. The nurses came in, turned off the machines, and left me alone with her for a few minutes. I cried like I hadn't cried since my parents died, not just for the loss of my grandmother, but for the complexity of what I now knew, for the weight of carrying a secret that would change the way anyone remembered her if it became public. The funeral was small, just a few elderly neighbors and a couple of friends from church who had known her in her final years. They all spoke of Martha as a sweet, devout woman who had overcome many tragedies in her life, and they weren't wrong. That was also part of who she had been. But I knew there was another Martha, one who had danced on the edge of the law, who had held a revolver with steady hands, who had survived a world most people can't even imagine. After the funeral, I decided to do two things. First, to use the money from the box to finish my university degree in criminology. Ironic, maybe, but it felt like a way to honor both her past and her wish that I have a better future. 3 months after my grandmother's funeral, I finally gathered the courage to look for Rosa Vargas in Monterey. I used the address from the notebook, although I didn't know if it would still be valid after so many years. I drove the 5 hours from San Luis Potosi with my heart in my throat, not knowing what I would find or what I would say if I actually found her. The address led me to a middle-class neighborhood with small but well-kept houses, gardens with flowers and children playing in the street. I knocked on the door of number 234, and after a few moments, a woman of about 70 opened the door. The resemblance to my grandmother was undeniable. The same green eyes, the same facial structure, although this woman was shorter and her hair was completely white. "Can I help you?" she asked with a kind but cautious smile. "My name is Elena Vargas," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm the granddaughter of Martha Vargas." Rosa's smile vanished instantly, replaced by an expression that mixed shock, pain, and something that looked like fear. "Martha," she whispered, bringing a hand to her chest. "How is my sister? It's been 40 years since we last spoke." I gave her the news of her death as gently as I could, and watched tears begin to roll down her wrinkled cheeks. She invited me in, and we sat in her small living room full of family photographs and potted plants. "She was just a girl when Martha disappeared from our lives," Rosa told me with a broken voice. "We had a humble family in Saltillo. Our parents worked in a textile factory. Martha was the oldest, the most beautiful, the smartest of us all. When she turned 18, she left for the border looking for a better life, promising that she would send us money. For the first few years, Martha did send money regularly, generous amounts that helped the family get ahead. But then, around 1970, the money stopped coming. We received a letter from her telling us not to contact her anymore, that it was for our safety, that there were things in her life that could put us in danger. Rosa never knew exactly what Martha had done, just vague rumors that she was involved with dangerous people. My parents died without seeing her again, and I spent my whole life wondering what had become of my older sister, if she was still alive, if she ever thought of us. I faced a difficult decision in that moment. Should I tell Rosa the whole truth about who Martha had been, or protect my grandmother's memory by revealing only part of the story? I decided to take a middle path. I told her that Martha had worked in a nightclub, that she had been involved with people in shady business, but I left out the darkest details. The notebook with the names of the dead, the revolver, the true reach of her participation in criminal activities. She stayed away from you to protect you, and that at least was completely true. Eventually, she left all that behind, married a good man, and raised me after my parents died. She spent her last years as a quiet woman devoted to her family and the church. Rosa cried when she heard this, a kind of crying that seemed to release decades of unanswered questions and misplaced guilt. I showed her some photographs I had brought, the less compromising ones from the box, where Martha simply looked young and beautiful. She touched them with trembling fingers, as if she could feel her sister through the paper. "She looked so much like our mother," she murmured. "I wish I'd had the chance to say goodbye." Rosa told me about the rest of the family I had never known. It turned out I had second cousins, a whole network of relatives living in different parts of Mexico.
Martha has two younger brothers, Rosa revealed. Sergio lives in Guadalajara. He has 4 children. And Patricia died 10 years ago, but she left 3 children who are still around here. The idea of having family, after years of thinking I was completely alone in the world except for my grandmother, was overwhelming. Rosa insisted I stay for dinner, and during the meal she showed me family albums full of photographs of people who shared my genes but were total strangers to me. There were children, teenagers, adults, all technically my family. "Do they know about Martha?" I asked. Rosa shook her head. I told them we had a sister who died young before they were born. It seemed easier than explaining the truth, that she disappeared voluntarily and never wanted to hear from us again. I felt a pang of sadness for my grandmother, imagining her living all that time with the weight of having cut ties with her original family, carrying that loneliness along with all her other secrets. Before I left that night, Rosa hugged me tightly. "You're the last piece of Martha we have left," she said. "Promise me you won't disappear like she did, that you'll stay in touch, that you'll let this family get to know you." I promised, though I didn't know if I'd be able to keep it. Back in San Luis Potosí, I sat in my apartment with the metal box in front of me, still undecided about what to do with its contents. The revolver scared me more than anything, not only for what it represented, but because having it illegally in my home could get me into serious trouble. I decided to get rid of it in the safest way possible. One night, I drove to a bridge over the Santa Maria River on the outskirts of the city, and after making sure no one was watching, I threw it into the deep water. I watched it disappear beneath the dark surface, taking with it any possibility that someone else might use it to cause harm. I buried the bullets in the building's garden, deep where they would never be found. The notebook was more complicated. It contained information that could be historically valuable, evidence of criminal activities that might help solve cold cases or bring closure to families who never knew what happened to their loved ones. But it also contained information that could stain my grandmother's memory and possibly endanger people who are still alive. After much reflection, I decided to keep it in a safety deposit box at the bank, with instructions that it could only be opened after my death or in 50 years, whichever came first. That way, the information wouldn't be completely lost, but it wouldn't cause immediate harm either. The money I used exactly as my grandmother had wanted, to finish my university degree and to establish a small fund I could someday use to help others. But putting away the physical objects didn't make the questions in my mind disappear. There were nights when I woke up thinking about the crossed-out names in the notebook, wondering who those people had been, whether they had families who still missed them, whether their disappearance had left scars in their communities. I began to investigate some of the names discreetly, searching old newspaper archives and public records. I found that several of them had been reported missing in the 1960s and 70s, cases that were never solved. One of them, a man named Antonio Mendez, had left behind a wife and 3 small children. I found his daughter, now a woman of almost 60, living in Ciudad Juárez. I wrestled with the idea of contacting her, of telling her I might have information about what happened to her father. But what exactly would I say? That my grandmother had kept records that had indirectly contributed to his death? That I had evidence but couldn't share it without destroying the memory of the only person who had raised me? In the end, I didn't contact her. I decided some doors are better left closed, that not every truth needs to be revealed. But that decision haunted me, making me question whether I was being selfish, whether I was putting my grandmother's memory above other families' need for justice. There were no easy answers, just the constant weight of a secret that now belonged to me. I started reading everything I could about the period when my grandmother had lived that secret life, trying to understand the context that had led her to make the choices she made. The 1960s on Mexico's northern border were turbulent times, with extreme poverty, limited opportunities for women, and a culture where survival often required moral compromises. My grandmother had chosen the second path, and although the consequences were dark, They had also given her the ability to survive, to eventually leave that world and to build a different life. I started to see her not as a simple criminal, but as a woman who had navigated a system designed to destroy her and who had found ways to take control of her own fate, even when that meant getting her hands dirty. It didn't justify what she had done, but I was beginning to understand it. 6 months after my grandmother's death, while cleaning out her old house before selling it, I found something else. A small diary hidden inside her mattress, in a pocket sewn into the lining. It was a simple notebook with yellowed pages and faded ink, full of entries written during the 1960s and 70s. Some entries were mundane, describing the weather or what they had eaten that day, but others were deeply personal, revealing the thoughts and feelings of the young Martha who had lived that double life. March 15th, 1966. Today, Roberto gave me a raise. Now I earn $300 a week, more than my father made in a month. But every dollar feels heavy, as if it were made of lead instead of silver. I know this money is stained by things I'd rather not know. Does that make me an accomplice? Probably, but it also makes me free, and that freedom is addictive. Another entry from 1968. I saw a man die today. Not directly, but I heard the shots. I saw them drag his body through the kitchen. He was a man who owed $50,000 and thought he could run without paying. Roberto says that's how it has to be, that debts are paid or paid with blood. I want to throw up. I want to run, but my feet won't move and my hands keep counting money as if nothing happened. What kind of person am I becoming? Reading these words broke my heart in a new way, because they revealed my grandmother had not been a criminal without conscience, but someone who had struggled internally with every decision, someone fully aware of the moral cost of her survival. But the entry that truly destroyed me was one in 1975, written shortly after my grandmother met my grandfather and started her new life. Today, I met a man named Carlos. He's simple, hardworking, honest in a way I barely remembered existed. He looks at me as if I were something precious, something pure. And I feel like a living liar, because if he knew half of what I've done, he'd run in the opposite direction. But I want this. I want to be the woman he thinks I am. I want to build something clean on the rotten foundations of my past. Is that possible? Or am I always going to be the Martha from El Pavo Real, no matter how many layers of normality I put over myself? There were entries about her marriage, about the joy of building a simple, peaceful life, and then, in 1983, an entry about my father's birth. My son arrived today. I held him in my arms and swore he would never know anything about my past. He will grow up thinking his mother is just an ordinary seamstress, and that will be the truth for him. I will give him everything I never had: stability, security, normality. I will be boring and predictable and completely ordinary, and it will be the most important performance of my life. And finally, an entry from 1992, shortly after my parents died and I went to live with her. Elena is mine now, this frightened 7-year-old girl who just lost her parents. I see so much of myself in her eyes, that mix of fear and determination. She gives me a second chance, a chance to raise someone with love and truth, or at least all the truth I can give her. She will never know about El Pavo Real, about Roberto, about the nights of blood and money. For her, I'll just be grandma, and that will be enough.
I decided I needed to honor my grandmother's desire to protect me, but I also needed to connect with the family she had left behind. I arranged a gathering with Rosa, Sergio, and Patricia's children, all my great-aunts, great-uncles, and cousins I'd never met. We met at a restaurant in Querétaro, a halfway point between our different cities. It was strange and wonderful at the same time. Seeing faces that shared my features, hearing stories about a grandmother I knew, but who for them was a mystery.
I told them about Martha's last years, about her kindness, her strength, how she had raised me with unwavering love. I showed them photos of her in her later years, smiling in the kitchen, hugging me at my high school graduation, celebrating birthdays. She was happy, I told them, and it was true. Despite everything she left behind, she found peace in her simple life. Sergio, a big man with kind eyes, hugged me with tears in his eyes. Thank you for bringing our sister back to us, even if only in photos and memories. Thank you for taking care of her when we couldn't. We decided we'd meet at least once a year, that we would keep alive the family connection Martha had sacrificed for reasons only I fully understood. And although I couldn't tell them the whole truth, I could give them this truth. Martha had loved them enough to walk away when she thought it was best for them. This discovery about my grandmother fundamentally changed the way I see the world and my place in it. I finished my criminology degree with a particular focus on rehabilitation and restorative justice, because I now understood that people are not simply good or bad, but complex beings doing the best they can with the choices they have. I started working with women coming out of prison, helping them reintegrate into society. And in each of them, I saw a bit of my grandmother. People who had made hard decisions in impossible circumstances, who carried the weight of their past while trying to build a different future. There were days when I wondered if I should have revealed everything publicly, if there were families who deserved to know what had happened to their missing loved ones. But then I would remember the diary, the words of a young woman wrestling with her conscience, trying to survive in a world that offered no easy second chances. And I decided once again that keeping her secret was the right way to honor her memory. I started writing her story, changing names and specific details, turning it into a kind of fiction based on real events. It was my way of processing everything I'd learned, of finding meaning in the moral complexity of her life. And maybe someday that story would help others understand that people are more than their worst decisions, that redemption is possible even when the past is dark. Over time, I came to some conclusions about everything I had discovered. First, I understood my grandmother had given me the greatest gift possible. She protected me from her past while she was alive, but she left me the truth for when I was strong enough to handle it. That required a kind of love and wisdom very few people have. Second, I learned that moral judgment is easy when you look at someone's life from the outside, but infinitely more complicated when you understand the full context of their circumstances. My grandmother had done questionable things, had been complicit in a violent system, but she was also a young woman trying to survive in a time and place where the options for someone like her were brutally limited. Third, I realized we all carry secrets, that all families have untold stories, and that part of growing up is learning to live with moral ambiguity instead of searching for black and white answers that rarely exist. The money my grandmother saved all those years, I used to establish a small foundation that helps women in economically vulnerable situations, giving them options my grandmother never had. I felt it was the right way to transform something that came from a dark place into something that could do good in the world. And every time I helped a woman escape a desperate situation, I thought of my grandmother, young, beautiful, and scared, making impossible decisions in the shadows of El Pavo Real. There was a moment, about a year after her death, when I finally managed to completely forgive my grandmother for everything she had done and everything she had hidden. I was visiting her grave, a small plot in the municipal cemetery with a simple headstone that listed only her name and the dates of her birth and death. I sat on the grass next to the grave and spoke to her as if she could hear me. Grandma, I've thought a lot about everything I discovered, about who you were before you became the woman who raised me. And I want you to know that I understand you. I may not approve of all the decisions you made, but I understand why you made them. You were a woman in a world of violent men with no formal education, no legitimate options to escape poverty. You did what you had to do to survive. And then when you had the chance, you chose something better. That's more than many people ever manage. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I spoke, releasing months of emotional conflict. I forgive you for the secrets, for the life you lived that I never knew about, for the weight you left on my shoulders. And more than that, I thank you. Because despite everything you had seen and done, you found a way to give me pure, unconditional love. You protected me from the dark world you knew so well. You gave me a childhood full of safety when you never had that safety. That's heroic in its own way. I felt a peace I hadn't felt in months, as if a knot in my chest had finally loosened. Now, several years after all this, I've learned to live with the complexity of who my grandmother was. When I think of her, I see both versions. The young Marta of El Pavo Real, strong and afraid, navigating a dangerous world with intelligence and determination. And the grandmother, Marta, I knew, soft and loving, baking cinnamon cookies and teaching me how to sew. Both were real. Both were her. And the tension between those two versions is what makes her story so deeply human. I've started sharing parts of her story with my cousins, Sergio's and Patricia's children, without revealing the darkest details, but giving them a more complete picture of who Marta had been. I tell them, our aunt was a survivor. She lived a complicated life before finding peace, and everything she did was with the goal of protecting the people she loved. Some of them have their own stories of relatives with complicated pasts, and these conversations have brought us together in unexpected ways. We've discovered that almost every family has secrets, that perfection is an illusion, and that true love means accepting people in all their imperfect complexity. The revolver lies at the bottom of the river, the bullets are buried, the notebook is locked in a safety deposit box. But the story lives in me, and now in carefully edited ways in the people I love. And maybe that's exactly what my grandmother wanted, for her truth to survive, but transformed into something that could help instead of hurt. The real inheritance my grandmother left me wasn't the money in that rusty box, nor the dark secrets, nor even the family connections I discovered. It was something much deeper. The understanding that life is complicated,